Welcome to Law Scribe Media. We are here today with Mr. Bernard Turner. He's an author, a historian, and a tour guide here in the city of Chicago. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like the viewers to get a little bit of an understanding of who you are as an individual, how you came into what you do today, and a little bit of the history, personally speaking. So if you could tell us that story.
Okay. Well, I'm a native Chicagoan, and I grew up in Brownsville. I also became a teacher. I was a teacher for a long time, elementary school, mostly middle school and high school. And I've also been involved with educational publishing for 30 years. And so I've always been involved with education in some form, either as in publishing or later on becoming an author. And one of the big incentives for me to become an author was I volunteer at the Chicago History Museum. And I've been doing a lot of tours and working with them in the galleries and so forth. And I wanted to be an expert on something. You think of people who go and get PhDs because they want to be an expert on some particular topic. And so I chose to learn a lot about the Brownsville neighborhood because that's where I was born and that's where my family originated. And I knew that a lot of history was in that neighborhood. In fact, my father was one of the only African Americans who had a Standard Oil station back in the 50s.
Wow.
So we were kind of a middle-class family rooted in the community. And I wanted to learn much more about that. And so that took me on a journey to writing books, researching, and learning more about Brownsville, as well as other neighborhoods in Chicago.
Okay. And how would you say, I think generally people know about the Renaissance in Harlem and some of the poets that it produced, but Brownsville, as a metropolitan center and a cultural center, not as much is known about it. So what specifically do you think makes Brownsville unique and very important in that historical period?
Well, Brownsville is one of the many cities in the North that benefited from the Great Migration. And when you think of a period of 40 years, from the 19-teens to almost 1970, over 6 million African American people migrated to places in the North, including New York City, including Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Iowa City, what have you. And Chicago was a beneficiary of maybe 600,000 African Americans who migrated to Chicago. And they brought with them a wealth of culture, a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of strength and ability, including writers, authors, dancers, researchers. And I think of New York as having a renaissance parallel to the Chicago Renaissance. And the Chicago Renaissance might even be just as important, if not more important, because some of the same people who were part of the New York or Harlem Renaissance also lived and worked in Chicago, namely people like Langston Hughes, for example, who wrote and also wrote in New York and also wrote and lived in Chicago for many years.
I didn't know that. I thought he was, because he's considered one of the major icons of the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, he is. He lived in Chicago, and he's one of the writers who gathered at the Hall Library in Chicago and the Abraham Lincoln Center, what's called the Abraham Lincoln Center right now, the Center for Inner City Studies, among many authors, and not Margaret Burroughs, but another Margaret, who were authors who lived in Chicago and worked in Chicago.
Wow. Okay. And so what would you say some of the distinctive features of that cultural renaissance here in Chicago and in Brownsville were that set them apart from other places where, individuals from the Great Migration, they gathered and they stayed? What made Brownsville unique in in the comedy of all those different areas?
Well, Brownsville was originally a neighborhood that was a middle class to upper class neighborhood, but also had some working class people in it. But during the 19 teens, 1916, African Americans started to migrate there. And because people could not move to other neighborhoods because of restrictive covenants, it made what was the Black Belt, which was originally called the Black Belt, a place where African American people were confined by restrictive covenants, and all of the culture, all of the writing, all of the literature, all of the business enterprise, all of the churches, the religion, everything was concentrated in that neighborhood because they couldn't go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And so that's what distinguished Bronzeville a little bit more. You think of what I termed the Black Belt as being something somewhat negative, becoming a black metropolis, which is something much more positive and much more dynamic.
Right.
Because the people there had to recreate all of the institutions that were in the rest of the city. They weren't able to get insurance in the community, so they built their own insurance company, or they didn't have the ability to go downtown, and you could go downtown and buy clothes, but that doesn't mean you could go downtown and try the clothes on.
Right.
So all of the stores that you would find downtown, not the name of them, but the kinds of stores that you would find downtown, you would find in the black metropolis.
And this was happening in other places as well. And I think one of the things that it reinforced was a self-sufficient kind of all-sustaining kind of a neighborhood where it was all contained, and anything you needed, you kind of had to go to an African-American business owner to, whatever service and products that you were looking for. And it kind of, I think the not just the cultural element of it, but the entrepreneurial element that it creates, and it reinforces that the community is cohesive.
Right. And not only that, you bring in the entrepreneurial part of it. Think of a community where you have people purchasing from the businesses in that community. That just means that the dollars keep circulating right. in that community, which is a very, very, very positive thing, very, very important.
Yeah.
And if we could recreate that now, wouldn't it be great? So those are some of the factors that I think make Brownsville unique. And when I think of some of the type of businesses, including insurance companies, Supreme Life Insurance Company, started in 1921, was a dynamic, very, very important business in that neighborhood. And it was able to last for many, many years, even past the Depression and past World War II. Another institution that grew up there was the Overton Company, the Overton Hygienic Company, which was cosmetics for black women. They could go downtown and buy cosmetics, but here is a business in Bronzeville where they make it and sell it, and they have salesmen going around selling it, or saleswomen selling it in the community, and so that circulates the dollars as well. And there are many other examples of that.
Yeah. What would you say is like some of the important elements that I'm assuming, and I haven't looked at the numbers, but I'm assuming like a lot of the crime that we see in like certain parts of our city where they're, jammed together, and now, there's obviously a lack of employment and other factors that are playing a role. How do you think that cultural dynamic that was there, and it was kind of an enclosed community, prevented some of the, cannibalization, let's say, that we see now?
Mm-hmm. Well, the fact that there were all these businesses in the community that provided jobs for the people there. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, what really caused the Great Migration was the availability of jobs in the wider community of Chicago. So many people came from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, for jobs at the stockyards or
Yeah.
jobs in the steel mills.
Right. Factories.
So it was, a combination of those kinds of jobs available as well as the homegrown jobs in the neighborhood, which would obviously keep the crime down. And many businesses like that have left not just Brownsville, but other communities in Chicago. And so that's part of why we have the problem that we do have.
You've been a gallery interpreter at the Chicago History Museum since 2000. Tell us a little bit more how you got involved with that and what you've done afterwards since you've been there.
Okay. I really started out as, I guess you'd call it a weekend person, because I was working full time. And I would work at the History Museum on Sundays. And it was kind of a low-key thing, manning the activity carts and talking to people who visited the museum. Approximately 3 years ago, I retired from my full-time job as a book publishing representative and became a gallery interpreter, which means I volunteer in the museum and work on the activity carts. Activity carts are activities that we do with school groups that come in. Usually they're third graders because that's where they study Chicago history in third grade. So we do activities related to the Great Chicago Fire. We focus on the bridges, which Chicago has more movable bridges than any other city in the country, 37 movable bridges. So we talk about the different kinds of bridges and how they evolved over history. We have another activity cart that focuses on artifacts. Children need to know the difference between artifacts, what artifacts are and what, animal bones and all of those kinds of things are much different. Artifacts are things that people made and used in the past, as opposed to the bones and fossils and things like that. So we talk about that. We also have a cart that focuses on skyscrapers. Chicago is the inventor of skyscrapers, so we talk about skyscrapers, and we have a maps card and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that we do with children. But I also do guided tours in the museum and focus on the history of Chicago from the period where the explorers came here in 1673, the French explorers I'm talking about, La Salle and Marquette, coming here to explore and to find the waterways that would take you from the East Coast to the Gulf of Mexico, and the history of Fort Dearborn, for example. Just after the Revolutionary War, 1803, they sent soldiers here to set up a fort to establish the United States in this part of the Northwest Territory, which it was called. So Fort Dearborn, the Great Chicago Fire, the World's Fairs, all of the pertinent Chicago history. So we do maybe about an hour tour with people who come to visit from out of town. And a lot of times the people are people who maybe lived in the city and moved to the suburbs, and now they're just coming back to rediscover the Chicago history. So it's a wide, diverse group. And I really love to meet people who come from other countries. I recently had a woman from Lithuania and another couple from Germany, and people from France and all over the world who come there. So it's a lot of fun to talk to them and take them on tours.
That's awesome. What do you think about DuSable's role in Chicago's history? Because it's somewhat unknown to a degree, depending on who you are and where you grew up, and how he fits in the grand scheme of things.
Well, he's the recognized first settler of Chicago, the first non-native settler of Chicago, and he's very, very important in Chicago history. And when you think about important people in Chicago history, DuSable has, where his trading post was located, has a marker at Michigan and Wacker.
Mm-hmm.
So he's pretty important. I guess a lot of people don't know that, but a lot of people.
There's
don't.
two individuals that are given more credit for establishing the city. I can't recall their names. Do you know?
Well, you're maybe thinking of John Kinsey.
Yes.
You may be thinking
so.
of John Kinsey.
Yeah. But they came after DuSable.
They came after DuSable. He was here in 1770, and he established his trading post. And he was a very important trader, because he traded with the natives who lived here. And he had a family here, too. And he stayed here until 1800. And I guess, there's a lot of controversy about why he left. But I think it had to do with the changing of the atmosphere of Chicago when he came here, to becoming more American and more, maybe he didn't like the environment as much. And he moved his family to St. Charles, Missouri. And that's where he lived out the rest of his life. And it might be because maybe he had a French-speaking background,
mm-hmm.
is from what I understand.
Right.
He might have felt more comfortable living in Missouri because there was more of a French influence there.
Okay. And some of the other individuals, many people know about Gwendolyn Brooks, but who are the other icons of Brownsville and Chicago as a whole that you would say are not necessarily highlighted in, say, history books, or individuals may not know as much about them, but they were important in the evolution of the culture here?
Well, when I think of culture in Chicago, I think of the advent of three important kinds of music that came with the Great Migration. The biggie is jazz. And you think of people like Louis Armstrong, who migrated from New Orleans here in 1921, 1922, got off the train at Central Station, 12th Street, and was just blown away by what he saw, and thought, my goodness, this place is gigantic. It must be a university or something like that. I can't think there's a tour. There's a quote in my book, A View of Bronzeville. This is my book, A View of Bronzeville. Yeah. And I won't look for the quote.
Well, I was going to ask about the book. I was going to say, what are some of the things that you found, like highlighted monuments, different kind of landmarks and things like that still exist that can help reconstruct the history?
Well, what this book is a what I always call a tour guide. Mm-hmm. And if you purchase this book, you can actually go on a guided tour, because it has the pictures and it has the addresses of the significant buildings in the city. And the cover is actually one of the landmarks of Brownsville. It's the 8th Regiment Armory, which was the armory which was built for an African-American regiment in the 1920s, actually before 1911. And these soldiers are the ones who are known for their gallant fighting during World War I in France. Mm-hmm. And there's not only the armory, which was built for them, but there is also a monument, which is also a landmark, which is about a block away, called Victory Monument, which is dedicated to these soldiers who fought in France in World War I, the 370th Regiment, the 8th Regiment, 370th troops.
Are all of their names memorialized at that location?
Many of the names are memorialized at that location. And also in the area, there are plaques in the sidewalk right in front of the monument, as well as on each side of King Drive. that memorialize many of the very famous people in Brownsville. But also right at that area in front of the monument, you can find out some of the leaders of the 370th Troops are memorialized right there. And speaking of the Walk of Fame, which is the plaques that I mentioned just before, on each side of the street from 26th Street to 35th Street, there is a series of 91 plaques. And the 91 plaques really are a key to who the famous people are from Brownsville. So you'll see a plaque there for Gwendolyn Brooks, who was the Poet Laureate of Illinois. You will also see in front of the King Library a plaque which is dedicated to Richard Wright, who was a very famous writer. He wrote Native Son and Black Boy, who also lived and worked in Brownsville. On that same plaque is Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry, a playwright who grew up in Chicago, later on moved to New York, but she's the one who wrote A Raisin in the Sun. Mm-hmm. I mentioned Langston Hughes. He's not on the plaque, but that poem, the name of her play, A Raisin in the Sun, comes from a line from a Langston Hughes poem. Mm-hmm. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And so forth. So those plaques will give you a clue to who the famous people are. Across the street, there's a plaque for Dinah Washington, who was a famous jazz singer, and many, many, many others. Just across the street from Gwendolyn Brooks, one of the jazz musicians who was very famous, Earl Father Hines, who played in one of the clubs, which was a couple of the clubs which were a block away from there. So all of these people and all of these heroes and artists are memorialized right there in the neighborhood. So that's why I love to do walking tours with people, because they can actually look down and see the plaque, and I can tell them, a little bit more about the people. But many of them are recognizable, and one person that a lot of people don't know about is Lawrence. Oh, wow. Lawrence, anyway, he was the first African-American astronaut.
Oh, okay.
And his plaque is right there by the Victory Monument. And nobody knows him because he didn't go into space, but he was the first African-American astronaut.
Wow. And one of the things that you also have done, you published a social studies book for children mm-hmm. called Our Chicago Peoples and Places. So I'm assuming some of the Brownsville history is in there, but what are the other stuff that you've also put in there for the kids?
Yeah, this book, this is for third grade. It's called Our Chicago People and Places, and it's a book that really helps kids to understand the history of Chicago. So the first part of the book is dedicated to DuSable, who he was, where he lived, and why he's important to the city. The second chapter is dedicated to early Chicago history. As I mentioned, the explorers coming here, Fort Dearborn, all of that history. The third part is Chicago becomes a city. So thinking of Chicago developing as a business center, the advent of the railroads, the shipping industry that was here and so important. Later on, the steel mills, and later on the Pullman plant that was here, and many of those things. Also, the Great Fire of 1871. A lot of people don't know Mrs. O'Leary's cow is really not responsible for that fire. We do not know how the fire started. So get that out of your heads. It wasn't the cow. And then I also put information here about the location of the city by Lake Michigan. And one thing that I just learned about recently, which I find utterly interesting, is the border of Illinois was not always where it is now.
Mm.
It was really lower, below where the lake was, and the port and the river and all that. But because the people who were doing the surveying and making up the borders and deciding on that, they wanted to have the port and the harbor of the river available as part of Illinois, because otherwise it would have been Wisconsin. And the ship traffic that comes from the northeast related Illinois more to the north and to the east than it related to the south.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about Chicago and Illinois history, we are definitely a northern state because of that connection to the north. And Chicago's history fighting in the Civil War, fighting for the north and against the South and the secession from the Union. So that was all part of the plan to make Chicago connected to the north, and they moved the border that way, which I find very fascinating.
And it still serves as a hub for a lot of different things,
Right.
including narcotics even. But I mean, it's a central location within the United States that connects a lot of stuff
Right.
through the trains and everything.
And you actually do call Chicago the crossroads because of the railroads, because of the shipping traffic, because of the air traffic. And interestingly enough, this fall, I gave a tour with 5 other people for a group of tourists who came from Germany. And they came to Chicago by ship.
Oh, wow.
From Ontario, from Montreal, Canada. So they travel from Montreal down the lakes and the rivers, the St. Lawrence Seaway, by way of Detroit, and landed in Chicago. We picked them up in buses, in groups, 7 different buses, and took them on a 5 or 6 hour tour of Chicago.
Wow.
Including the Sky Deck and or the Hancock Observatory.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 choices they could choose from. But to know that Chicago can actually accommodate ships with that many people in a harbor just south of the city, it was utterly fascinating.
Yeah.
To meet these people and to talk to them. And they were just so excited about coming to Chicago and learning about it. And I was one of the people who was chosen to do the tour.
Mm-hmm.
And another cool thing was they didn't speak English. And fortunately, I was a German teacher when I was a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
so I was able to do the tour in German.
Oh, wow.
So that was kind of cool.
Did that require any prep, since you probably don't practice German that often?
I
right?
don't practice German hardly at all, so yes, it did require some preparation for me.
Yeah. You also co-wrote and published a book called Tate and His Historic Dream,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a finalist for a Phyllis Wheatley Award. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Tate and His Historic Dream is a book that I co-wrote with Michelle Duster. And we were very fascinated by a painting that we saw a few years ago. And the painting is called The Time Has Come. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but the painting depicts African American history from slavery to Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And it features 28 figures, or 28 important figures in African American history
Yeah.
who have made a contribution to the history of this country.
Who's the painter?
The painter is Darryl Spicey. He's a Chicago artist.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, he painted this painting before Barack Obama was president.
Wow.
So he kind of had a vision that was going to happen. So we saw this painting, and we thought, wow, I wonder how many young people know who these people are, or how many of them they can name.
Yeah.
And just about always they can name
2 or 3.
Martin Luther King, they can name Barack Obama, some of them can name Rosa Parks. Surprisingly, they don't know Malcolm X.
Yeah.
Some of them know Frederick Douglass. Um, they don't know a lot of these characters. So we wrote an interactive children's story about a fourth grader who has to write a paper about one of these people. But he, like other kids, puts it off till the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't like history. He thinks it's stupid. And he would really prefer to go out and play. But of course, his mother won't let him go out and play until he does his homework. So while he's sitting there complaining and kicking himself and all that, the characters start to come alive. In fact, he sees these slaves in a slave sale. And he's, wow, he's seeing this, and it's a dream, of course, but he's seeing this and he's learning what it was like and how cruel it was and so forth. The next person he sees is Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley was the first African-American published poet in the United States.
What year was that?
1700s, in the 1700s. But how many kids know about Phyllis Wheatley? They don't know anything about Phyllis Wheatley. And then the next person who comes into the story is Frederick Douglass. And so he finds out about how someone like Phyllis Wheatley, who was a slave, learned to read and how important it was to her because she didn't have her family. And she became a poet. And Frederick Douglass, he was a slave. He taught himself to read because it was so important to him to be able to read. And he was one of these extremely important figures in African American history. So this becomes a way for Tate, the character, and by the same token, other young people to learn about their history and learn about the people who paved the way for them. Barack Obama is particularly important because he was the first African American president. But these people were people who guided him as well, and he would probably be the first to tell. So our goal is to get these books into schools. And I've been somewhat successful with it, particularly in suburban school districts and a couple of Chicago schools. But I really want to get these into schools to help kids know who these people are. Mm-hmm. I recently was teaching in a Saturday university with the Black Star Project, which is a organization that helps mentor kids. Mm-hmm. And so they have a Saturday university to help kids to develop their literacy skills. And I was taught this story to the kids, and they were like 4th maybe to 8th grade, but they didn't know who these people were. So it was very gratifying to help them to learn about the history, and they were very interested in it.
Now, is the book set up to be like a workbook, or is it does it have activities that you can possibly create a workbook for?
It's actually a storybook, so it's a story, but we also created a teacher activity guide to go along with it. Okay. So the teacher activity guide helps them to put together a timeline. For example, what is the timeline between when there was slavery and when Rosa Parks would not give up her seat, and who are the people who would fit on that timeline? Or what is the vocabulary associated with the civil rights movement, segregation, the Jim Crow laws, all of those kinds of vocabulary, activities that focus on comprehension and writing skills, which is really very important for young people. So we did create a teacher activity guide to go along with this. And also, my co-author and I, Michelle, her great-grandmother is one of these people in the book. She's the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells.
Oh, wow.
So it was kind of nice to work with somebody who really brought in...
Tell the viewers a little bit about Ida Wells, because some viewers may not know who she is and what her significance is.
Mm-hmm. Ida B. Wells was a journalist, primarily, who was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I don't remember the exact date. But she was very militant for a young woman. And she wrote a lot about the injustice of lynching. And for that reason, her newspaper and her livelihood was jeopardized when she was living in Mississippi. So she had to move. I believe she moved to New York and continued to write about lynching and, explaining how this injustice was still perpetuated in the United States. Later on, she came to Chicago, still as a journalist, but she was also very instrumental in helping the people who migrated here from the South find jobs, to find places to live. And she was a civic leader and really a hero here in Chicago as well. So that Ida B. Wells is one of the important characters in the book.
And that was actually, we met, was it a week ago, I believe, at a Chicago book fair that we held at the AMC Center at 44th and State. And it was because of that painting that I was drawn to the table. And that's where we started our discussion, because I did recognize, I would say, about half the people I could see on the in the painting. And I just thought it was very unique because it helps kind of create that chain of history. Mm-hmm. So you understand where certain things fall into place. And it's I think how many schools did you say were you able to get that in now?
There's only a couple of Chicago public schools, but in the suburbs there's the Markham School District, which is School District 144, the Harvey School District 147, mm-hmm. The Glen Brookwood School District, and several other school districts, mainly in the south suburbs, because I have a really good relationship with them, but I'm still plugging away.
Yeah, on that. It takes time. I know there's usually bureaucracy set up that take a while to kind of break through.
Yeah, you really have to have relationships, and so that's kind of what I'm working on right now.
And segueing on that, obviously, you're dedicated to this, and you really want to impart the wisdom and knowledge and awareness of history as it relates to Chicago and maybe in the grander scheme, African American history. What would you recommend to individuals who are also on the same path in order to make their work more meaningful, because they're able to get it into not necessarily the school system, but find a way to get the ears and eyes of the youth in a variety of different ways? What kind of stuff would you recommend that they do in order to get their information and their work to the youth?
Well, I think that for me, doing the work that I do at the Chicago History Museum, that helps me to get that word out in a regular way. Just routinely, I'm talking about Chicago history, but I'm also trying to partner with different organizations in the neighborhood and volunteering and offering tours to different groups. So that's really how I'm doing it. I also have a blog that focuses on topics in Chicago history as well. It's kind of difficult to get that information out there, but I guess if somebody were interested, they could find it. But every time I get an opportunity to tell a teacher about the blog or tell them about the books, I do that. And I do, as I mentioned, volunteer work as well. So,
are the teachers generally receptive to some of the stuff? Because I imagine it would be an informative process for them too. I mean, given how scant resources are and how you have to pull from different places, and you actually do research and maybe even go to historical actual artifacts and things like books and things like that. Mm-hmm. What would you say the reaction is generally from the teachers?
They're always very interested. I admire teachers because they have a very difficult job. Mm-hmm. Especially in the environment that we are in today. And the second thing that's difficult for them is economics. They don't have money for resources, and a lot of them do spend their own money. In fact, I'm sure a lot of these books get purchased by teachers using their own money. because they can buy it at the teacher store in Chicago. They can also go to DuSable Museum and purchase this book, which I'm sure a lot of teachers are people who purchase these books. But I would say if you have a story to tell, put it down. Maybe write something, write an op-ed, put it in the paper. My thing really is doing the tours, and I'm trying to attract more groups and family reunions and school groups and so forth to go on tours, and that's what I do.
Okay. And some of the historical individuals, they left behind certain things from the slave period that, probably like a lot of individuals don't know is how many people came from West Africa, and, the fact that some of them were highly esteemed individuals who were very well read and left behind things. I know from our community, some of them were Muslim, some of them wrote back the Quran from memory. And a variety of different things. There was a guy named Ibrahim Diallo who I mentioned on the podcast before, but he was able to create his own freedom right after he was enslaved because he refused to work, and he had such spiritual power that his slave master was afraid of him, and they couldn't beat him, they couldn't kill him, and then they just sent him back.
Wow.
So there's a lot of that history that you do have to kind of dig up and find. But it's very important to have resources available, and in our community center at 44th Estate, we'd like to have, like, if you wouldn't mind, to be involved in helping us decide what kind of literature that we can help mass produce. So individuals in the community, if we have after school programs, would be able to just come and on their own time. Maybe if like we have some issues getting everything into the schools, we'll be able to create programs for individuals and kids and stuff like that to come and visit and learn outside of that.
Yeah, I would love to work with you to do that. And I have a lot of resources, not necessarily things that could be copied, but at least things that could be referenced, that could be taken out of the public library, or things that can be looked up online. So I would be happy to help with those kinds of resources.
And this is a question I try to ask anyone who's involved in the community, because obviously there's some driving, motivating factor behind all of this. It's not just so simple as like you just a historian and you're, kind of an objective observer of it. What do you think are the ways to in really ignite the passion behind these types of subjects? Because as we know, one of the things that I've noticed in the last, I would say even more in the last 15 years than ever before, has been because of the proliferation of social media, and there's so much information at our fingertips, but it's kind of what you're interested in that you're going to end up researching. So the format of the medium, like whether it's a book or if it's a short play or if it's a video or a YouTube video, it has to be something that engages right away. So what are some of your recommendations around given that the youth have a different kind of media that's available to them, how to impart some of this stuff in those formats that they will be able to easily access and create that interest where they will take the further steps to go on and research themselves?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess I would have to say I'm kind of old school, and I really like books, and I really like touching books and handling books. I'm not opposed to social media. I do have a Highlights of Chicago Press page on Facebook, and I do have a Twitter account, which is Highlights Press, at Highlights Press. And I do put my blogs, articles, and photographs on Facebook and so forth. I haven't done an ebook yet. I guess I'm just kind of an old school type person. I just haven't gotten into the ebooks, but I could very easily change any of these books into ebooks.
Well, that book specifically, I think that it may do very well as an audiobook. And when not just an audio book, because sometimes I saw an individual at the book fair who had his book in an audio form, but he had the robots kind of do it. And when you do that, it takes away some of the passion and the energy that you would have behind it. So just going into a studio and recording, if it's a storytelling book, then you're infusing the story with the tonalities and things like that could
Right.
really create that. So that could be a good supplemental thing
Right.
that they could have in addition to the book itself.
Yeah, we've actually given a lot of thought to doing a video of this book, because as opposed to many books about people that are biographic in nature, this book is not biographic in nature. It's interactive because it's a dialogue between the main character Tate and these characters and among the characters. So I'm actually in the market for someone who could help us turn this into a video that would be more appealing maybe to younger people, that we could also have available for libraries. I'm not sure what the format would be or what, but we've been talking about that for quite a while.
Okay.
So if you have any ideas, I'm interested.
And that's one of the reasons I do this, is because I want to be able to let people connect with other individuals who maybe that's their area of expertise. So,
Mm-hmm.
so an individual that you wrote about on your blog was William Tillman. Tell us a little bit more about William Tillman and his history and his importance.
Well, William Tillman was a cook on board a schooner during the Civil War. And the schooner, I believe, left its base in, I believe, New Jersey. And they were going, taking cargo to an island in the Caribbean. And as they were traveling on the sea, they were boarded by a Confederate boat crew and captured. And William Tillman, because he was a slave, well, he wasn't a slave, he was a free man, but he was a black. He was a cook. He was given leave to go move around the ship. And at a certain point during this captivity, he was able to overcome the guards and free the ship from the Confederates, and the ship was able to return back to its port. So he was one of the heroes of the sea, a black man who fought against the Confederates. And you think of another one who was like that was Robert Smalls, who was he wasn't a captain of the ship, but he was the one who actually guided the ship, and he took one of the ships from the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, and drove it past the Confederates and gave it to the Union. So he was another hero like that during the Civil War.
Were either of these individuals recognized by the wider historians of the Civil War?
They were.
Okay.
Robert Smalls was, and I believe he actually ran for office and became a legislator, a politician, a legislator.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've given us a lot of information today. I really appreciate you coming on. Give the viewers some of the places that they can connect with you and some of the work you're doing. I know there's highlightspress.wordpress.com.
Yep.
And then anything else that you'd like to plug, so individuals that can, number one, hopefully assist you with maybe perhaps getting that into an audiobook and anything else, and then also just connect with you maybe to do a tour or whatever.
My website is highlightsofchicago.com. And the blog site is highlights.wordpress.com. And my email is bern, BERN, at highlightsofchicago.com. And my books are available at DuSable Museum,
Okay.
57th Street Books, several other places, the Architecture Foundation. And if you want, give me a call. 773-425-2807.
That's I really appreciate you giving the number out, because one of the things that I feel like some of the individuals who want to become authors and things like that, they don't have like, what do I do first, and how do I get this out? So that's one of the things that I hope that we can inspire other people to pursue that path on their own. Any parting wisdom for anyone in that kind of pathway and they want to go that direction?
Yeah, if you're interested in writing or publishing, send me an email and I can connect you with an organization that I'm involved with called the Chicago Black Authors Network. And if you're interested in finding out more about Chicago Black Authors Network or CBAN, just go to our website, which is ChicagoBlackAuthorsNetwork.net.
Okay.
And check us out. And we're interested in having new members come and join us as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I hope we'll be able to do it again. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.